There are places in the deep woods that feel wrong before you can explain why. Not dangerous in any way you were taught to recognize. No sudden sound, no movement in the brush, no animal warning call cutting through the dark. Just a feeling that settles over you slowly. The way cold settles into wet ground, quiet and thorough and impossible to shake once it's in. This is one of those places. A crude plywood deer stand at the edge of a pine forest. Nothing remarkable about it in daylight. Boards weathered gray, posts sunk into soft earth. The kind of structure a man and his son might throw together over a weekend and feel proud of for years. But night changes what a thing is. And out here, at the edge of the tree line, with the cold fog pooling low across the frozen ground and the pines pressing in from every side, that single flashlight beam cutting up through the gaps in the boards isn't comfort. It's a question, because the light is there, but the man who brought it isn't. Whatever happened here didn't happen all at once. It built slowly, the way the worst things always do. One sound, one morning, one night too many in the wrong stretch of woods. Derek T. went up to that lease alone for the first time in the fall of 2019, and what he brought back with him wasn't a deer. It was something he still hasn't fully put down. This is his story. It was the fall of 2019, 2 hours north. A hunting lease Derek had known since he was a boy. He'd gone every season with his father. Same woods, same stand, same stretch of pine ridge that felt like theirs in the way a place feels like yours when you've shared enough quiet mornings in it. But that year his father was recovering from knee surgery, and for the first time Derek made the drive alone. He got there on a Thursday, staked his tent about 30 yards from the old deer stand, got the propane stove going, told himself 3 quiet days alone was exactly what he needed. The weather didn't agree. That particular gray, damp cold that gets into your boots no matter how good your socks are had settled over the whole ridge, and by the time the tent was up and the camp stove was lit, the light had already gone flat and blue. That dead hour just before dark when the forest stops looking like a place you chose and starts looking like a place that simply has you in it. He ate. He listened to the wind working through the pines, and he turned in early. There was nothing else to look at. The first night was normal. He would tell you that himself. Whatever was already out there in those woods, and something was, it had the patience to wait one more night before it introduced itself. The small amber glow of the camp stove was the only warmth in all that dark. And the deer stand, 30 yards back, stood perfectly still in the cold. The knocking came on the second night. A single deliberate double tap from the direction of the deer stand. Not a branch snapping, not ice shifting, not the random percussion of an animal moving through brush. A knock, the kind you'd put on somebody's front door if you wanted them to know you were there. Derek sat up in his sleeping bag and listened for a long time after that. Nothing followed. He told himself it was a raccoon, told himself it was the cold cracking the boards, told himself all the things a reasonable man tells himself in the dark when he doesn't want the alternative to be true. He didn't get up to check. But in the morning he walked over anyway, and what he found, or more precisely what he didn't find, was the thing that stayed with him. The mud beneath the stand was bare. Smooth and gray and completely undisturbed. No tracks of any kind, not even deer, and that spot always had deer tracks. He stood there in his hunting vest and looked at the ground under the platform and did the math on what that meant and didn't like where it landed. Something had been close enough to knock on those boards, and it had left no evidence it had ever touched the earth. He stood there for a long time, long enough that the flat gray morning light had barely shifted by the time he finally turned and walked back to camp. Some answers you look for, some you find by accident, and some the ground simply refuses to give you. He almost talked himself out of leaving. That's the part that matters. By Saturday morning, he'd spent 2 nights telling himself there were reasonable explanations, and he was close. Close enough that he might have packed the truck calmly, driven home, and filed the whole thing under strange but forgotten. Then he walked out of his tent and saw the tarp. It had been staked down over the cooler the night before, all 4 corners pinned into the frost-hardened earth, the way he always did it. Now it was folded, not blown off by the wind, not torn free by an animal, folded. A clean, deliberate rectangle, sitting on top of the closed cooler lid like someone had tidied up while he slept. The 4 metal stakes were still in the ground exactly where he'd driven them, just with nothing attached to them anymore. He stood there and looked at it for a long time. The absence of any disturbance around it was the worst part. No tracks in the frost, no drag marks, no sign that anything had moved through that space at all. Just the tarp, folded with a kind of careful, unhurried precision that implied hands. Unhurried hands. Hands that were entirely comfortable being there in the dark, close to where he was sleeping, doing something as quiet and deliberate as folding a tarp and setting it down just so. He picked it up. He set it aside. And then he sat down and thought for a very long time about whether he was going to stay one more night. He stayed. He would regret that before morning. That last night he woke to footsteps. Not the snap and scatter of an animal moving through brush. Something measured. Deliberate. Boots on frozen leaves, or something that moved like boots, circling his tent at a pace so steady and patient it felt almost procedural, like something completing a task it had done before. It went all the way around once. The full perimeter, slow and even, without pausing, without rushing. And then it stopped, directly behind his head, close enough that what came next was audible through the tent wall, breathing. Not an animal's breath, not panting, not the ragged exhalation of something exerting itself. Long, even breaths, the breathing of something standing perfectly still in the dark, just on the other side of a thin layer of nylon, in no hurry at all. Derek lay completely motionless with his hand wrapped around the rifle stock and waited for the tent fabric to move. It never did. He doesn't know how many minutes passed. Felt like a long time. Long enough that the stillness became its own kind of pressure, the sense that whatever was standing there knew he was awake, knew he was listening, and simply didn't care. Eventually the breathing stopped, and the footsteps started again. The same slow, unhurried pace, moving away toward the tree line, fading into the dark, until he couldn't hear them anymore. He did not sleep again that night. He lay in the dark with his rifle, watching the tent wall for movement that never came, and waited for the light to turn gray. At first light, Derek broke camp in 15 minutes and drove straight to the ranger station. He said he needed to say it out loud to another human being before he could be sure it had actually happened. The ranger who came back out with him walked the entire perimeter of the old campsite without saying much. And then he stopped. There in the frost, pressed clean and deep into the white ground around the bare rectangle where the tent had stood, was a complete circle of boot impressions. One set, one loop, a large men's boot, evenly spaced, circling the tent once, and then cutting off toward the road easement. No prints anywhere leading in. No prints leading out beyond that single loop. Just the circle, complete and deliberate, in ground that should have recorded every step of the approach. The ranger said it was probably a trespasser, someone scouting the lease to poach later in the season. He said he'd flag it to the county. He couldn't explain the folded tarp. He couldn't explain how a full loop of boot prints existed in the frost without a single impression showing how they got there or how they left. Derek never went back to that lease. His father sold his half of it the following spring, and never said exactly why. Derek still hunts, just not alone anymore, and not anywhere without a marked access road and a second set of eyes. Some lessons come cheap. That one did not, and the circle in the frost, complete, unbroken, unexplained, remained exactly where they found it until the morning thaw took it away. The second story doesn't have a name attached to it. The person who lived it asked to stay anonymous, and once you hear the reason, you'll understand why. What they left behind is this: a cabin window, fogged on the outside in a pattern that isn't weather. Not condensation drift, not frost creep. A deliberate oval smear pressed against the exterior glass, the shape of a mouth held close, the shape of breath applied with patience and intention from the outside of a window in a pine forest at night where no one else was supposed to be. Inside, a lantern. Outside, nothing visible, just black forest and cold glass and that mark on the pane that shouldn't be there. It happened every evening at the same time, a little after 6, with a consistency that implied routine. That's the part that got under the skin before anything else. Not the sound that came later. Not the thing that made it inside without a door or a window opening. Just the reliable, punctual fog on the glass. Every evening, same time, same shape, as if something had a schedule and saw no particular reason to hide it. This is the story of a 21-year-old alone in a rental cabin with no cell service, for nights booked, and something outside that had apparently been there before he arrived and fully intended to stay. He'd booked 4 nights at a hunting camp cabin he found online. One of those rustic one-room setups at the end of a 2-mile gravel road. No cell service, a generator for power, pine forest pressing in on every side. He was 21. He'd hunted with his father and uncles his whole life but had never gone completely alone before, and that was the whole point. The isolation wasn't something to be endured. It was what he'd come for. He wanted quiet. He needed it. His first solo trip since his divorce, and he'd chosen the remotest place he could find, which in hindsight is either brave or unlucky, depending on what you know going in. The first 2 days were exactly what he'd wanted. He hunted mornings, read paperbacks in the afternoon, slept long and deep in a way he hadn't in months. The cabin sat at the end of its gravel road like a thing that had always been there. The single porch bulb the only warm light in all that darkening blue-gray dusk. The pine forest a complete wall in every direction. The creek running 100 yards behind the place. He felt, for the first time in a long time, genuinely alone. Felt like relief. The only odd thing, and he almost didn't count it as odd, was the window. Every evening, a little after 6, it fogged on the outside. Same time, same shape. He told himself it was a temperature thing. He told himself a lot of things that first 2 days. The 3rd night cured him of that habit entirely. It started on the 3rd night. He was reading by lantern light when he heard it, whistling. Outside, close to the porch. A slow 3-note tune, unhurried, almost lazy in its repetition. The kind of sound that would be completely unremarkable anywhere else and was profoundly wrong here. He froze, called out through the door, asked who was there. The whistling stopped the exact second he spoke. Not trailing off, not fading, stopped. He told himself it was another hunter from a neighboring lease who'd wandered off his land. Told himself that whistling wasn't exactly a hostile thing to do. He didn't grab the rifle propped by the door. He just sat there for 20 minutes in the amber glow of the lantern, listening to nothing, the porch outside going quiet in a way that felt less like absence and more like waiting, and eventually convinced himself to go back to his book. The porch was empty. He could see that much through the cracked door. Just the dark planks, the porch rail, and beyond it the absolute black of the pine forest, the tree trunks barely suggestions at the edge of the light's reach. No figure, no shape, no source for the sound at all. Just the open door, the narrow wedge of amber light falling across empty boards, and the forest beyond, silent now, patient, as if whatever had been out there had simply stepped back into the dark and decided to wait for a better moment. It didn't have to wait long. Around midnight, something hit the cabin wall. Hard. Once. Like a fist applied with purpose. Not a branch, not an animal, a deliberate single impact that left no ambiguity about what had made it. He checked his watch. Waited. 10 minutes passed in complete silence. Then it hit again, opposite wall this time. He did the math. Whoever it was had walked a full loop around the cabin between the 2 strikes and done it slowly, on purpose, taking their time. He still didn't call anyone. There was no signal to call anyone with. And some stubborn, insisting part of him kept saying it was a prank, that he'd feel ridiculous packing the truck at midnight over knocking. So he stayed. But his hands told a different story than his reasoning did, because his hands dragged the one heavy dresser in that cabin across the floor and shoved it flush against the front door without him consciously deciding to do it. The dresser sat wedged against the door in the amber lantern light, solid and immovable, and he sat on the edge of the cot with the rifle across his knees and watched the door and listened to the forest outside go completely, unervingly quiet. There's a particular kind of silence that isn't restful. It's the kind that has weight, the kind that feels supervised. He sat in the middle of it with every muscle still, the lantern throwing his shadow large against the log wall behind him, and told himself one more time that this was going to have an ordinary explanation in the morning. The dresser stayed against the door all night. The fourth night, it came inside. He woke to the whistling directly beneath the loft, that same slow three-note tune, the one that had been outside the window, outside the door, outside the cabin walls. Now it was below him, inside the room, close enough that whoever was making it had to be standing in the middle of his one-room cabin, directly under where he slept. He looked down from the loft into the room. The dresser was still against the door. He could see it from above, unmoved, exactly where he'd left it. The bare bulb hanging from the ceiling cast its hard pale light down onto the empty floor. And the floor was empty. No figure, no shape, nothing standing in the middle of the room that should have been making that sound. The far wall, solid log construction, no door, no window, just timber and chinking, stood exactly as it always had. He watched from the loft, rifle in both hands, while the whistling continued for close to a full minute. Patient, almost bored. The same three notes, cycling, as if whatever was making them had nowhere else to be and no particular concern about being heard. Then it stopped. He heard footsteps cross the floorboards, slow and unhurried, from the center of the room toward the far wall. And then silence. No door, no window, just the wall. And the footsteps simply ended there, against solid logs, as if whatever had crossed that floor had walked directly into the timber and ceased to be. He did not move from that loft until sunrise brought enough light to prove the room was empty. The dresser hadn't moved an inch. He hiked out at first light, flagged a truck on the county road, and got a ride to cell service. 2 deputies drove him back. They walked the exterior of the cabin first, boot prints circling the building, consistent with the third night, fresh and deep and clearly human. Then they went inside. On the wood floor, in dried mud, were 2 sets of tracks. One set tracked from the far wall, the solid log wall, no door, no window, diagonally across the floor toward the loft ladder. The second set returned from the ladder back to that same wall, where they stopped. One of the deputies pressed on the wall boards with both hands, checking the full length of the log construction for a hidden panel, a loose board, any gap at all. He found nothing. Solid timber throughout, nothing behind it but forest. The other deputy crouched on the floor and examined the prints in silence for a long time without saying anything useful. They ran the truck battery and found nothing mechanically wrong with it once it was jumped. No explanation for why it had died and no explanation for how it had died at exactly the time it did. The cabin booking account had been deactivated by the time he tried to leave a review. No host, no record, as if the listing had existed for exactly as long as it needed to and then quietly ceased. He never found out who owned it. He still hunts, but he doesn't book anything he can't verify belongs to a real person with a real name. And sometimes, in November, around 6 in the evening, he catches himself whistling 3 notes he doesn't remember learning. The third story has a different quality to it than the others. Not because it's louder or because the events are more dramatic, but because of the words. 2 of the 3 stories in this collection involve sounds without sources, prints without origins, things that moved in the dark and left evidence that couldn't be explained and couldn't be argued away. This one has all of that, but it also has a voice. Low, male, directly against the cabin door at 3 in the morning, saying 3 words that Marcus R. has spent a long time trying to make sense of. 3 words that implied not just presence, not just intrusion, but continuity, history, the sense that whatever was on the other side of that door had been keeping track. Look at what's pressed into the dirt at the base of the doorstep. 1 boot print, facing the door. No approach tracks, no departure tracks, just the single impression, placed as if by something that didn't need to walk to get there and didn't need to walk to leave. A hairline of amber light bleeds under the door from inside. The only warmth in the frame, barely touching the print, barely reaching the dirt, and the treeline behind it is a solid black wall. What was on the other side of that door knew the name of the arrangement. It knew whose turn it was, and it had come to say so. This is Marcus R.'s story. Marcus moved to a small town near the state forest boundary 2 years ago for work, and that first autumn his coworker invited him to join the family hunting camp. For cabins his grandfather had built decades back, way off a logging road that barely qualified as one anymore. 6 of them that opening weekend. The first night was everything a first night at camp should be. Loud, warm, good company, whiskey around the fire pit, the kind of easy familiar noise that fills a clearing and pushes the dark back to the treeline where it belongs. 3 of the 4 cabins had lights in their windows. The 4th, the smallest one, at the far edge of the clearing, closest to the pines, was dark. Marcus was the newest addition. The others had claimed the larger cabins by seniority, which he didn't mind. The small cabin was his, maybe 40 yards from the nearest occupied one, slightly more isolated than the rest. He sat around the fire that first night, learning names, listening to old stories about this stretch of forest and these particular woods, feeling like exactly what he was, the new guy trying to fit in with a group that had hunted together for 30 years. The fire burned low and orange against the dark, the wood smoke rising slow through the pine canopy above, the camp feeling genuinely alive and genuinely normal. He didn't know yet about the smallest cabin. He didn't know what Pete would say at dinner 2 nights later. He had no reason, sitting in the firelight that first evening, to look at the dark 4th window and feel anything other than tired and content. The second night, after everyone had turned in, Marcus heard something dragging outside his cabin. A slow, heavy, scraping sound. Not an animal foraging, not the wind moving debris, something deliberate. The sound of weight being pulled across dirt, moving from one side of the cabin to the other and back. He told himself it was one of the older men moving firewood or gear. Told himself that, and the whiskey he'd had helped him accept it, and he went back to sleep without getting up to check. But the third night Pete mentioned, offhand at dinner, that the smallest cabin had a habit, that camp had what he called a couple of odd spots, and that nobody slept in that cabin 2 seasons running without something happening, and that they just rotated so it never became anyone's specific problem. Everyone laughed. Marcus laughed too. He noticed that nobody explained what something happening meant, and when he asked, Pete said you'll see or you won't and changed the subject. That night the dragging sound came back, and this time it stopped directly under his window and held there for close to a full minute before moving on. He got up, looked out through the gap in the blinds, saw the moonlit ground outside, cold, blue-white, hard-lit, completely undisturbed. No shape, no drag mark visible, no figure at the treeline, no movement anywhere in the cleared ground beside the cabin. Just the dirt, the moonlight, and the impenetrable black wall of pines beyond. The sound had been real. The ground had recorded nothing. These 2 facts sat beside each other in the dark and refused to resolve. In the morning he checked, and the marks were there. A long, shallow furrow pressed into the dirt beside the cabin wall. Straight, deliberate, running the full length of the structure and then stopping. Stopping cleanly, in open ground, approximately 6 feet before the treeline, as if whatever had made it had simply been lifted off the earth at that exact point and carried, or ceased, without any further disturbance to the ground beyond. He brought the group out to look. Pete examined the furrow for a long moment without saying much, offered the theory that the ground back there floods sometimes and shifts on its own. Marcus didn't push back out loud, but a 6-foot straight furrow that stops mid-stride doesn't come from ground shift, and everyone present could see that, and most of them were quiet in the particular way people get quiet when they already know something and have decided not to be the one to say it. 2 of the older men exchanged a look across the furrow that Marcus wasn't supposed to catch. He caught it. He didn't know yet what it meant. By the last night, he had a better idea. The furrow lay in the flat gray morning light, its endpoint 6 feet from the pines, as clear and clean and unexplained as it had been when the sound made it in the dark. A mark in the earth that started somewhere, went somewhere, and then simply ended, as if the thing that made it had decided it was close enough. The last night, Marcus woke at 3 in the morning to the dragging sound again. But this time it didn't stop under the window. Came to the door. One slow, deliberate scrape against the wood, and then silence. And then evenly spaced 5 seconds between each 3 knocks. Slow, patient, the kind of knocking that isn't asking permission. He sat up in the dark with the rifle across his knees, too afraid to call out and too afraid to stay silent, watching the thin line of cold blue moonlight under the door and waiting for the knocking to stop or for the door to move. The knocking stopped, and then the voice came, low, male, directly against the door, close enough to be standing with lips near the wood. 3 words, only 3. Still your turn. Nothing else. No footsteps leaving afterward. No dragging sound retreating into the woods. Just silence, immediate and complete, the way silence falls when a sound doesn't fade but simply stops existing, as if the source of it had been switched off at the exact moment the last word left it. Marcus sat with the rifle in the dark and didn't move and didn't sleep and replayed those 3 words in the order they came and tried to build a sentence around them that made ordinary sense. He never found one. He sat in the dark until the moonlight under the door shifted to gray and the gray shifted to the flat white of early morning. And then he walked straight to Pete's cabin and said everything. Pete's face changed. He recognized something. He covered it fast. He told the others they were breaking camp early. Weather, he said. Nobody argued. Before they left, one of the older men, without explaining why, took a shovel and walked to the tree line behind the small cabin. He didn't dig. He walked to specific spots along the forest edge, pressed the blade of the shovel against the ground in a few deliberate places, examined the earth at each one with a downward, unhurried attention, nodded to himself and walked back to the trucks. Marcus asked him what he was looking for. The man said nothing you need to worry about, and that was the end of it. Months later, Marcus asked his coworker straight out, what did "still your turn" mean, and what was the history of the smallest cabin? The coworker went quiet, said his grandfather never talked about how he first got that land. Said some of the old-timers used to say the camp was built on a spot that had an arrangement with something in those woods. A thing his grandfather had never fully explained, not even to his own son. He said it like a joke. He didn't quite meet Marcus's eyes when he said it. Marcus moved away from that town about a year later for unrelated reasons. On his way out, he drove past the turnoff to the logging road one last time. There was a truck at the gate he didn't recognize. Beside it, facing the woods, back to the road, stood someone he couldn't get a clear look at no matter how slowly he drove. He's told himself a dozen times it was probably just another hunter. He still doesn't believe it, and he still hasn't worked out whose turn it actually was. Some arrangements don't ask your permission before they include you. They just wait until you show up.